She was 7 months pregnant when they put her out into the night. The rain was falling, cold, hard, without mercy, and she had nothing but the wrapper on her back and the life growing inside her belly. The chief stood at the gate of his compound, and his face showed no sorrow. No doubt, nothing. Behind him stood Madame Iphioma, and there was a small smile on her lips that the chief could not see. "Leave this place," the chief said. "Whatever is in your womb is not mine." She opened her mouth. No words came, because some betrayals are too large for words. She walked away into the darkness. The gate closed behind her. It closed gently, as if she had never been there at all. But the child she was carrying, that child would one day make that gate open again, and this time it would be the chief on his knees. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Her name was Isioma Ezek, and the night they drove her out was the night that changed the destiny of 2 families forever. She was barefoot on red earth that the rain had turned to mud, with nowhere to go and no one to call. The gate of Chief Obiora Nwasu's compound had just closed behind her. She stood in the road for a long moment, her hands pressed over her belly, feeling the child move inside her, a small, insistent flutter, as though the baby itself was saying, "We are still here. We are still here." She did not cry. Not yet. She looked up at the sky, black and pouring, and she made a promise, a quiet, iron promise. She would survive this, and her child would thrive. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? To understand how Isioma came to be standing alone in that rain, you must understand the world she had walked into when she married into the chief's family 2 years before. Chief Obiora Nwasu was not a cruel man. That is important to say. He was proud, deeply, stubbornly proud, in the way that powerful men often are. Men who have never had their power questioned, men who have never had to doubt themselves. He was 61 years old, the paramount chief of Umyuk village, and he had spent 3 decades building a legacy that people whispered about with admiration, and sometimes with a little fear. His compound was the largest in the village. 10 rooms, a wide veranda, where elders sat to deliberate, mango trees that had been planted before the chief was born, and a kitchen that smelled always of palm soup and bitter leaf. He owned a black Toyota Land Cruiser, the only one in all of Umyuk, and when he drove through the village, people stepped off the road to let him pass. Not because they were afraid, because they respected him. He had married Madame Iphioma when they were both young. She had been his first wife, his companion through the years of building, and she had given him 3 daughters. 3 beautiful, intelligent daughters. But in this village, in this tradition, the absence of a son was a wound that quietly deepened with every passing year. The chief had never spoken of it openly, but Madame Iphioma had felt it in the way the elders sometimes looked at her husband during meetings, felt it in the congratulations given to other men whose sons walked behind them. She felt it like a stone in her chest, and over the years, that stone had hardened into something else entirely. When the chief took Isioma as a second wife, a young woman of 26 from the neighboring town of Ogut, the daughter of a school teacher, quiet and hard-working and gentle, Madame Iphioma had welcomed her with open arms, a warm smile, and a plate of food. And Isioma, who was young and trusting, had believed completely in that warmth. Isioma was not a woman of wealth. She had come into the chief's compound with little, a small box of clothing, some books she loved, a photograph of her late father, and a heart full of hope. She woke before anyone else to sweep the veranda. She cooked with care. She greeted every elder with both hands. She asked for nothing she was not given, and when, in her 2nd year of marriage, she discovered she was pregnant, she had gone to tell the chief with tears of gratitude on her face. He had held her hands and smiled a real smile, the smile of a man whose long-held prayer was finally being answered. But Madame Iphioma had watched that smile, and she had begun to plan. She went first to Mama Chiniere, the village gossip who lived near the market, and she whispered a story. Just a story that she had seen Isioma speaking with a young man at the edge of the compound one evening. Nothing specific, just a conversation, just a suggestion planted gently, like a seed in soft ground. Then she went to her brother, a man named Reginald Okafor, who drove a commercial bus on the Oguta road. She paid him to tell the chief casually, as though it were common knowledge, that Isioma had been seen with a man in Oguta before the marriage. An old flame. A boyfriend who people said had never truly disappeared from her life. The lie was small, but it was planted in a proud man's heart. And proud men, when they begin to doubt, do not stop at the edge of their doubt. They fall all the way through. By the time Isioma was 7 months pregnant, the chief had been living with a seed of suspicion for 4 months. Madame Ifeoma had watered it carefully, quietly, every week. A look here. A question there. My chief? I am not saying anything. I am only telling you what a wife must tell her husband. The night the chief put Isioma... It was Reginald who brought the final lie, a photograph, taken in Oguta of Isioma, standing beside a young man who was, in truth, her cousin. But Reginald told the chief it was the boyfriend, and the chief, whose pride was already whose doubt had already become conviction, the chief believed it without asking a single question. He called Isioma before him that night. He showed her the photograph. "Who is this man?" he said. "My cousin," she said. "Obiora, that is my cousin Emeka. You have met him, you." "Enough," he said. "Do not insult my eyes." And that was how it ended. With a photograph, with a lie, with a gate closing in the rain. Isioma walked through the night without knowing where she was going. The rain came down in heavy curtains, soaking through her wrapper, running down her face, filling her sandals with mud until she took them off and carried them in her hand. The road was dark. No streetlights, only the occasional crack of lightning that lit the red earth ahead of her empty, long, stretching into nothing. She was 7 months pregnant. She was 28 years old. She had 30 naira folded into her wrapper. She had taken nothing when they called her out. So suddenly, so finally, 30 naira, and a life growing inside her, and a long road that seemed to have no end. She walked 4 kilometers in that rain. She walked until she reached the compound of an old woman named Mama Ngozi, in the village of Akpaja, a small widow who had known Isioma's late father, and who had always shown her kindness at market days. She stood at the door and knocked. When the door opened and the old woman saw her soaked through, belly round under the wet wrapper, eyes dry but something broken behind them, Mama Ngozi said nothing. She simply opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in," the old woman said. "Come and sit down." Isioma sat. And it was only then, only when she was inside, when the door was closed against the rain, only then did she begin to cry. She pressed both hands over her belly and wept quietly, deeply, the way you weep when the thing you are crying for is too large to make a loud sound. Mama Ngozi put a cup of hot water in her hands and sat beside her without speaking. She waited. She let Isioma finish. When the crying was done, Isioma looked up. "They said the baby is not his," she said. "It is his baby. Mama, this child is his child. You know me. You have known me since I was small. You know I am not that kind of woman." Mama Ngozi looked at her for a long time. Her old eyes were steady and careful. "I know who you are," she said finally. "And God knows, too." Isioma slept in Mama Ngozi's back room that night, on a thin mattress, with the rain still falling on the zinc roof above her. The sound of it was like a hand drumming on something hollow. She lay still, her hands on her belly, and she spoke to the child growing inside her. She did not know yet if it was a boy or a girl. "Whatever they say about you," she whispered, "you are made of good things. You come from a good place. I will show you." 2 months later, in the small health post of Akabeja village, Isioma gave birth to a boy. He came into the world without crying. He arrived quietly, his eyes already open, already looking, already searching. The nurse who delivered him laughed and said she had never seen a baby born so calm. Isioma named him Kaloshi, which in her language means, "God has the greatest plan." She looked at her son's face. She saw his father's nose, his father's serious brow, his father's way of already seeming to consider the world. She felt the grief of it, like a stone in her chest. But she also felt something else, something certain, something that did not tremble. She said to him, Your name will mean something, I promise you that. But now there was a question hanging over Akpaja village that nobody had yet thought to ask, because Mama Ngozi, who had lived long and seen much, Ada Philindib and unsettled that the photograph the chief had shown Isioma was not what it appeared to be, and she had begun, very quietly, to ask questions. The years that followed were not easy, but they were real. Isioma found a small room to rent at the edge of a kabaja, one room, a concrete floor, a window without a screen, and a door that had to be lifted slightly before it would close. She paid 3 months' rent with money borrowed from Mama Ngozi and promised herself she would never borrow again. She worked the way only a woman with something to prove can work. In the mornings, before Kelechi woke, she braided hair for market women, her fingers moving fast and sure in the early light, earning money coin by coin. In the afternoons, she sold ground nuts and boiled eggs along the roadside, Kelechi on her back in a cloth wrapper, his small warm weight steady against her spine. In the evenings, she mended clothes by lamplight, other people's blouses, other people's trousers, other people's school uniforms, while Kelechi slept and the lamp cast orange shadows on the walls. She never bought new clothes for herself. Every coin she saved went into a small tin she kept under the mattress, and every coin in that tin was for one thing only: Kelix's school fees. When Kelechi was 6, she enrolled him in the primary school. She walked him there on the first day, carrying his school bag, a second-hand bag, scrubbed clean, mended at the straps. She knelt in front of him at the school gate and straightened his collar and looked at him. "Listen to your teacher," she said. "Ask questions when you do not understand. Be kind to the children beside you. And remember," she pressed her hand over his heart, "remember where you come from. Not the rejection, the love." Kelechi nodded. He was always a serious child, and he walked into that school and sat in the front. Rowan paid attention to every single word his teacher said. He was not just bright, he was extraordinary. His teachers noticed within the first term. He finished his exercises before everyone else, and then helped the children beside him. He read every book in the small school library twice. By the time he was 10, the headmaster was calling Isioma in to say that her son had a gift, that this boy, if given the chance, could do anything. Isioma sat across from that headmaster and felt something warm move through her chest. She held it together until she was back on the road outside. Then she pressed her hand over her mouth and stood still in the morning air and breathing until the feeling passed and she could walk normally again. C went home. She worked harder. Now, back in Umuk, in the chief's compound, something was happening that Isioma knew nothing about. A woman named Amaka had begun to talk. Amaka was a trader who had, in those years, been close to Reginald Okafor, close enough to have heard things that a wise woman would have kept to herself. She had heard Reginald on the telephone one evening, laughing about the photograph he had shown, the chief laughing about how easy it had been, how readily the old man had believed everything. She had heard a name she recognized. Isioma. She had heard Reginald say to whoever was on the other end, "The baby is his." Of course, the baby is his. But what does that matter now? Amaka had kept that knowledge like a coal in her hand, burning her, impossible to put down, impossible to throw away. For 4 years, she carried it, until the day she went to confess it to a man she trusted, Papa Chukudi, the catechist of the church in Akpaja, a quiet and righteous elder who knew both villages and everyone in them. She sat across from him, with her hands folded. "Papa Chukudi," she said, "I need to tell you something that I should have said for years ago, and God will not let me sleep until I say it." Papa Chukudi sat very still, the kind of man who knows how to receive difficult things without moving. She told him everything. When she finished, the room was quiet. He looked at his hands. "Does Isioma know?" He said. "She knows her own heart," Amaka said, "but she does not know that someone can prove it. Then she needs to know," Papa Chukudi said. He went to Isioma that same week. When he told her what Amaka had heard, when he laid out the shape of the lie, the photograph, Reginald's laughter, Madame Ifeoma's months of careful whispering, Isioma sat very still at her table. Kelechi was at school. The room was quiet. A fly moved slowly against the window glass. She said nothing for a long time. Tense said, "How long have you known?" "I learned yesterday," Papa Chukudi said. "I came to you today." She nodded. "And Amaka, will she speak?" "She will speak," he said. "She is ready." For a long moment, Isioma was quiet. Then something shifted in her face. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter than anger. Something that had been waiting a very long time. "Not yet," she said. "Let me wait. Let me be ready." She looked at the tin under the mattress. Then she looked at the window and the road outside. "When the time is right," she said, "we will speak." But Papa Chukudi had not finished. He had gone, quietly and carefully, to ask for Reginald's telephone records from a man at the local telecom office, a favor returned for a favor given long ago. What he received was not the words of the lie, but it was something almost as powerful, a record of 17 telephone calls between Reginald Okafor and Madame Ifeoma Nusu in the 3 months before Isioma was expelled from the compound. 17 calls. From a man who had no ordinary reason to be calling the chief's senior wife 17 times in 3 months. Papa Chukudi placed those records in a manila envelope and gave them to... She folded the envelope carefully and placed it with the tin under the mattress. "Now I have everything I need," she said quietly. "But now is still not the time." The years passed. Kalichi moved from primary school to secondary school on a scholarship. He moved from secondary school to university on a full bursary, the best student in his state, a young man whose name teachers passed between themselves with something that sounded almost like awe. He studied medicine. He studied with the discipline of someone who had watched his mother work every day of his life and understood deeply that nothing of value comes without cost. He knew who his father was. Isioma had not hidden it from him. When Kalechi was old enough to carry it, she had told him everything. The compound in Umyuk, the chief, the photograph, the rain. She told him without bitterness, or as little bitterness as a human being can manage when the wound is 30 years old. "You must not carry hatred for your father," she said. "He was deceived. He was proud. He made a wrong choice. But you were made in love, and that is what you must carry." Kelechi had listened to this, at 17, in their small room, with the lamp casting orange shadows on the walls. He had listened with his father's serious expression on his face. "Will it ever be corrected?" he asked. Isioma looked at him for a long moment. "Truth always finds its way," she said. "Like water. It always finds its way." And then something happened that neither of them had planned for, but that felt afterward as though it had been arranged by someone far wiser than either of them. Dr. Kalichi Ezek, 31 years old now, a physician, a man of quiet achievement, a man who wore his success without boasting and his humility without apology, received an invitation. He was invited to Umuhu, not as the chief's son. His connection to that compound was not known in Umyuk, where Isiom's story had faded over the years into the kind of thing people half remembered and never fully spoke of. He was invited because he had done something remarkable. He had built, at his own expense, a free medical clinic in the town of Aguta. A committee of local leaders and development officers wanted to honor young men and women from the region who were building something real. The ceremony would be held in the largest hall in the area, the hall of the paramount chief of Amuki, Chief Obiora Nuosu's hall. When Isioma heard when Kelechi telephoned her that evening and told her, she sat down and put a hand over her mouth. "Mama," he said. "Mama, are you there?" "I am here," she said. "I think it is time," he said. A long silence. "Bring Amaka," she said finally. "Bring Papa Chukudi. Bring the envelope." "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes." Her voice was steady. 31 years is long enough to wait. Truth has been patient. Now it is time for truth to speak. The ceremony was held on a Saturday. The whole of Chief Obiora Nuosu's compound was full elders, community leaders, development officers and prestagbadas, women in their finest wrappers, young people standing at the back where there were no more chairs. The smell of jollof rice and egusi soup drifted warm from the kitchen. The room was bright and loud with the sounds of an important gathering. Dr. Kelechi Ezek sat in the front row, in a clean white agbeda, his hands resting calmly on his knees. It was 31 years old. He had his mother's gentleness and his father's serious face, though no one in that room yet understood what that combination of features meant. Chief Obiora Nwasu sat at the head of the hall on his carved wooden chair, white-haired now, 73 years old. Smaller than he used to be, as powerful men sometimes grow smaller when the years take from them what youth once gave. But his eyes were still sharp. He watched the young man in the front row with the particular attention an elder gives to someone who has earned his respect. Speeches were made, the young doctor's work was described in full, the clinic, the free medications, the women's health program, the midwives he had trained and employed. A development officer from the state capital said that this was the kind of young man Nigeria needed. The room applauded. Then it was time for the chief to present the honor. Chief Obiora Nwasu rose from his chair and descended from the dais. He walked to the young man and placed a carved ceremonial staff in his hands, the kind given to those who build for their community, without asking for recognition. The chief looked at the young man's face. Something moved behind his eyes, a feeling without a name. "Young man," he said, "I am told your name is Kelechi Ezek. I am told you come from the Akbegia side. I am told your mother raised you alone." Kelechi looked at him steadily. "Yes, chief," he said, "my mother raised me alone. Her name is Isioma Isaac." The room was quiet. It became quieter. That name moved through the chief like cold water. He had not heard it spoken in 31 years. He had not allowed himself to think it. He had built walls around it in his mind, walls of pride, of self-justification, of all the things a man tells himself when he has done something he cannot bear to examine. And now, in front of his entire community, all those walls shifted at once. "Your mother?" the chief said slowly. "Isioma." "Yes," Kelechi said. He did not flinch. He did not look away. "I believe you knew her." At the back of the hall, the door opened, and Isioma walked in. She was 60 years old. She wore a deep blue wrapper and a matching head tie, both of which she had bought for this day, the first new clothes she had bought for herself in 30 years. She walked with her spine straight, her hands at her sides, her eyes on the front of the room. She looked like what she was, a woman who had carried an impossible weight for a very long time and had not been broken by it. Madame Ifeoma, seated to the side of the dais, looked up. Her face changed completely. The room grew very still. Isioma walked to the front of the hall and stood beside her son. She looked at the chief. The chief looked at her. Papa Chukwudi rose from his seat. He was 82 years old and slow-moving, but his voice was still clear and strong. He addressed the gathering. He told them what Amaka had heard. He produced the telephone records, 17 calls between Madame Ifeoma and Reginald Okafor in the 3 months before Isioma was expelled. He produced a sworn and signed statement from Amaka, describing precisely what she had heard Reginald say on that telephone. The baby is his. Of course, the baby is his, but what does that matter now? The room broke open. Voices. Movement. Women covering their mouths with their hands. Elders turning to look at each other in stunned silence. Madame Ifeoma stood. "This is lies," she said, her voice rising. "Old lies from old enemies. Do not believe, madame." Papa Chukwudi's voice was quieter than hers. Far quieter, but it stopped her completely. "The records speak. The witness speaks, and the young man's face speaks. Those of you who have said nothing can already see whose face is on this boy." The room turned to look at Kelechi. The room turned to look at the chief. One by one, they saw it. The same brow, the same serious expression, the same eyes that had looked out from the chief's face for 73 years. Chief Obiora Nwasu stood at the center of his own hall, in front of his community, in front of his elders, in front of the son he had cast out before the boy ever drew breath, and the walls he had spent 31 years building came down all at once. He turned to Madame Ifeoma. "Did you do this?" His voice was very quiet, the quietness of a man standing at the edge of something very deep. "Did you know the child was mine?" Madame Ifeoma looked at him. Her composure, the composure she had maintained for 31 years, cracked like dry clay. "I did what I had to do," she said. For my daughters. For our family. She would have pushed us aside. You destroyed a family, the chief said. To protect one. Not angry. Not loud. Something worse than anger. Something hollow and echoing. You threw a pregnant woman into the rain. And you let me believe? He stopped. He pressed his hand to his chest. You let me believe for 31 years that I had done the right thing. He turned away from her. He turned toward Isi. She was watching him. Her face was quiet. No triumph on it. No cruelty, just a woman who had waited a very long time for truth to find its way. Isioma, the chief said, her name broke in his mouth like something old and dry finally giving way. Isioma. You were deceived, she said. Her voice was steady, warm, even impossibly warm, given everything. But chief, deception only holds a man who chooses not to ask. You showed me a photograph of my cousin, and you did not even ask me his name. You chose the story that preserved your pride. And a child, your child. Your own son grew up without you, because your pride was worth more to you that night than truth. The room held its breath. Isioma looked out at the gathered faces. The elders, the women, the young people standing at the back. I am not here for revenge, she said. I am here because my son deserves to be seen for what he truly is, a man who built something good in this world, despite being abandoned by the people who should have protected him. I am here because the truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs time, patient as water. It always finds its way. If this story is moving you, subscribe now. The ending will change how you see everything. Chief Obiora Nuasu walked out of the hall, not away, not in retreat. He walked through the door and down the 3 steps from the entrance and stood on the red earth of his compound, the compound he had built, the compound whose gate had once closed on a woman in the rain. He stood there in full view of the community that had followed him out, pouring through the door behind him. Because they all knew, they all felt that something was happening that they would tell their children and their children's children about. He walked to where Isioma had followed and stood on the red earth. And Chief Obiora Nusu, paramount chief of Omuk, a man who had never knelt before any living person, went down on his knees. On the red earth of his own compound, in front of his elders, in front of his community, in front of the son he had not known. He pressed his face into his hands, and he wept. Not the brief, dignified tears of a man performing sorrow. Real weeping, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the chest. The weeping of a man who has seen, all at once, the full shape of what he lost and what he allowed to be destroyed. 31 years of it. A son's childhood, a woman's long suffering. A family that should have existed and did not. He wept. Isioma looked down at him for a long moment, and then she knelt too. She did not touch him at first. She simply knelt on the red earth, beside him, at his level, and looked at his face. "Get up," she said quietly. "Get up, Chief. This earth has seen enough of our pain." She took his hands, the hands of the man who had sent her out into the rain, and she held them in both of hers. And in that gesture was everything the story had been building toward. Not the triumph of the wronged over the wrongdoer, but something harder and rarer and more beautiful than triumph. Forgiveness that had not yet been asked for. Given first, given freely. Kalichi stood watching his parents, his father's hands, in his mother's hands, his father's tears falling on the red earth of the compound where Kalichi had been denied the right to be born. He stood still for a long moment. Then he walked to them and knelt between them, one hand on each of their shoulders, and the 3 of them were there together on the earth, in front of the whole community. And no one spoke. The development officer from the state capital, who had been standing in the doorway with his mouth open, said later that it was the most extraordinary thing he had witnessed in 30 years of public service. Madame Ifeoma was brought before the Council of Elders that same afternoon. What had been done, the conspiracy, the photograph, the 17 telephone calls, the years of deliberate whispering, was laid out formally and completely. She did not deny it again. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and she said nothing. The elders deliberated for 2 hours. Their judgment was this. Madame Ifeoma Nusu would make a formal public apology to Isioma and to Kalichi before the community. On the first Sunday of the following month, she would leave the chief's compound. She would not return. Her 3 daughters, who had known nothing of their mother's actions, were not punished. But the marriage was ended, finally and officially, in the presence of the full council of elders. Chief Obiora Nuasu did not fight the judgment. He accepted it in full. He had only one request, not of the council, but of his son. He found Kalichi later, when the crowd had thinned and the compound was quiet. He stood before this tall, quiet young man who had his nose and his brow and his serious way of holding the world in his eyes. "Can you?" the chief began, and stopped, because the words for what he wanted to ask did not come easily to a man like him. "Can you forgive me? Not because I deserve it. I know I do not deserve it. But because you are my son, and whatever I failed to give you, I would try, in whatever time I have left, my mother taught me." Kalichi said that a man is not only the choices he makes when things are easy, he is also the choices he makes when things are hard. He paused. "You are making a hard choice right now. That counts for something." He held out his hand. The chief took it, and for the first time in his life, Chief Obiora Nusu shook hands with his son. The truth, having waited 31 years, had finally found its way. Like water. Exactly like water. 12 months passed. When the rains came again to Amuk and Akbaja, they came to a different world. Isioma had moved, not far. She was not a woman who needed a grand gesture to feel that her life had been restored. But she now lived in a proper house. 3 rooms, a ceiling, a veranda with a view of the road, a kitchen with a real stove, and a mango tree in the compound that reminded her of the mango trees she had once swept under in the chief's yard. Kalichi had built it for her. He had built it on the land where Mama Ngozi's house had stood. Mama who had opened her door on that rainy night and asked for nothing, had died peacefully 2 years before, and had left her land to Isioma in a handwritten note that still lived in the tin under the new bed. At the house opening, Isioma stood on the veranda in the morning light and felt, for the first time in 31 years, that she was entirely home. The smell of red earth drying after rain, the sound of a neighbor's rooster, the warmth of sun on her hands. She did not braid hair anymore. She ran a small cooperative for women in Akbaja, teaching skills, managing small loans, connecting women to markets for their goods. The development office from the state capital had sent her seed funding after the ceremony. They said they had never before given funding based on a chief's weeping, but felt it was entirely justified. She was known in both villages now, not as the woman who had been thrown out, but as the woman who had walked back in. Kalichi's clinic in Oguta had expanded. For more doctors, government recognition received. He drove a modest car and lived in a modest apartment and sent money home every month. Money that Isioma sometimes kept and sometimes gave to the cooperative and sometimes quietly pressed into the hands of women who needed it more than anyone knew. He visited Omuk. Sometimes he sat with the chief, his father, on the veranda of the old compound, under the mango trees. In the evenings, when the light was soft and gold, they did not speak Azeli. Yet there were 31 years of silence between them that could not be filled in an afternoon. But they were learning. Visit by visit, conversation by careful conversation, the way you learn anything true. Slowly, honestly, without pretending it is easier than it is. Chief Obiora Nuasu had grown quieter since that day. Not sadder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that comes to a man who has looked clearly at himself and accepted what he saw. He sold the black Toyota Land Cruiser. He donated the money to Kalichi's clinic. He did not say why. He did not need to. Madame Ifeoma went to live with her eldest daughter in another state. She did not come back to him. Her 3 daughters visited Isioma together one afternoon. All 3 of them, sitting on her veranda with their hands in their laps, and asked for forgiveness on behalf of their mother. Isioma had given it without hesitation. She had offered them tea. She had asked about their children. They stayed 3 hours, and left with something lighter in their faces than what they had arrived with. Papa Chukudi, 82 years old, slow-moving, easily laughing, was given the seat of honor at Easy. He sat in the best chair on the veranda, and ate his food with great satisfaction, and said he had waited his whole life to see truth move the way it had moved that Saturday in the chief's hall. "The thing about truth," he said, setting down his plate and looking out at the evening, is that it does not need to be loud. It just needs to be patient. Patient and stubborn, like water on stone. Isioma sat beside him and nodded. "Yes," she said, "like water on stone." And so the story ends the way all true stories must end, not with the powerful remaining powerful without consequence, not with the suffering remaining silent forever, but with the earth restored to what it was always meant to be. A place where a mother's love can build a future, even from the rubble of a terrible night, and where the truth, given enough time, always finds its way home. The woman who had been thrown into the rain was not broken by it. She was carried by it, and the child she sheltered in her hands all the way through that darkness became the light that found everyone, even the man who had sent them out. A man who casts out the truth does not destroy it. He only delays the day it returns. To find him, thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you never miss a story. Watch our next story right here.